David Miller had spent most of his adult life behind the wheel of Melbourne city buses. The job was predictable, almost mechanical. Route after route, stop after stop. Some passengers greeted him with a polite nod. Others ignored him completely. It didn't bother him. He enjoyed the solitude that came with the job. The rhythm of the city flowing past his window. That night, as he navigated through the illuminated streets, the bus was unusually quiet. A few exhausted commuters sat in silence, their faces bathed in the glow of their phone screens. The hum of the engine filled the empty spaces between the occasional cough or shifting seat. David stole a quick glance at the clock above the windshield. 9:42 p.m., almost at the end of his shift. At the next stop, the doors hissed open with a familiar release of air. A handful of passengers disembarked, including a woman holding the small hand of a child. David barely noticed them at first. Just another mother and daughter heading home. But something about the child caught his attention. The little girl, no older than 5, had large, expressive eyes that darted around as if searching for something. Her soft brown curls bounced as she moved, and she wore a pink jacket that looked slightly oversized. She hesitated on the last step of the bus, her small fingers clinging to the metal railing. David was about to close the doors when it happened. The girl suddenly wrenched free from her mother's grasp and turned back toward the bus. "Emily," the mother called, startled. David's hand froze over the controls as the child darted up the step and grabbed onto the sleeve of his uniform. "Please help me," she whispered. David's breath caught in his throat. The words were barely audible, but there was something in the way she said them, something raw and urgent. Her tiny fingers trembled as they clutched at the fabric of his jacket. Before he could respond, the mother lunged forward and seized the girl's arm, pulling her back. "Emily, what are you doing?" The little girl didn't resist. She allowed herself to be dragged away, but her eyes never left David's, wide, pleading, terrified. "I'm so sorry," the mother muttered, avoiding his gaze. She pulled Emily close, wrapping an arm around her protectively. Then, without another word, she turned and hurried away into the crowd. David sat there, unmoving. The doors slid shut, and the engine rumbled beneath him, but his hands remained locked on the steering wheel. His pulse pounded in his ears. Something about that child's face, the way she had whispered for help, sent a deep unease crawling up his spine. He glanced at his side mirror, catching a final glimpse of the mother and daughter disappearing down the street. The mother was walking briskly, her grip tight on Emily's wrist. For the rest of the route, David couldn't shake the image from his mind. He had driven this bus for years and seen all kinds of people, tired workers, drunk teenagers, lost tourists, but never had a child begged him for help. What had she meant? Was she in danger? Should he have done something? By the time he pulled the bus into the depot, David was still wrestling with the questions swirling in his mind. He climbed out of his seat, stretching his stiff limbs, but the weight in his chest remained. As he locked up for the night and made his way to his car, a strange, nagging thought settled in his mind. That little girl's face, those wide, terrified eyes. Somehow he knew this wasn't the last time he would see her. David Miller barely slept that night. Even after he got home, showered, and lay in bed, the memory of the little girl haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those wide, desperate eyes staring up at him, her tiny fingers clutching his sleeve. "Please, help me." Her whisper echoed in his mind, a ghostly plea that wouldn't let him rest. He told himself it was probably nothing. Maybe she was just scared of the dark. Maybe she had a wild imagination, like most kids. Maybe her mother was strict, and Emily mistook discipline for danger. But none of those explanations sat right. Something about the way the mother had pulled her away, hurried, almost nervous, bothered him. By morning, David had convinced himself that he was overreacting. He drank his coffee in silence, watching the sunrise through his apartment window. It was just another day. He would do his shift, drive his usual route, and let it go. Or at least, that was the plan. Then, around noon, the news broke. David was at a small cafe near the bus depot when he heard a frantic voice coming from the TV mounted on the wall. Police are searching for missing mother and daughter, Sarah and Emily Carter, last seen 2 nights ago in Melbourne's city center. David's blood ran cold. He turned toward the screen. The news anchor was speaking quickly, urgency in her tone. Beside her, 2 photos appeared. One of a smiling woman with dark hair, and the other, Emily, the little girl from the bus, the girl who had whispered for help. David's hands clenched around his coffee cup. A chill spread through his body as he listened to the report. According to family members, Sarah Carter and her 5-year-old daughter Emily were last seen leaving a bus near Flinders Street on Wednesday night. Witnesses recall seeing them walking toward a taxi stand, but they never made it home. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. David's stomach twisted. Flinders Street? That was his stop, his bus. The girl had asked for help just minutes before they vanished. The weight of that realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He barely noticed the scalding heat as his coffee spilled onto his hand. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just his imagination. Something was wrong. Without hesitating, he pulled out his phone and dialed the police. 20 minutes later, David was sitting in a police station, recounting everything. To a detective named Rachel Hughes. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that studied him carefully as he spoke. "So you're saying Emily asked for help on your bus?" she asked, jotting down notes. "Yes," David replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "She grabbed my sleeve and whispered it. She looked scared, Detective." Hughes tapped her pen against the table. "And the mother? Did she seem suspicious?" David hesitated. She pulled Emily away quickly, apologized, but something felt off, like she was in a hurry to get away. Hughes nodded. "Did they seem like they were being followed?" "I don't know," David admitted. "I didn't notice anyone at the time. But," he exhaled sharply, "I can't stop thinking about that moment. I should have done something." Hughes gave him a reassuring look. "You couldn't have known, Mr. Miller, but you did the right thing by coming forward." She glanced at the file in front of her. Sarah Carter is a single mother. No known enemies. No history of abuse or violence. But something doesn't add up. Her phone was last active near an abandoned parking lot 10 blocks from your stop. After that, nothing. David swallowed hard. And Emily? Hughes hesitated. No trace of her yet. A heavy silence filled the room. David felt an unbearable weight settle in his chest. Emily was missing. And the last time anyone saw her, she had been begging him for help. David had spent the last 3 days feeling like a man drowning in guilt. Ever since his conversation with Detective Hughes, he had replayed that moment on the bus over and over in his mind. What if he had stopped Emily from leaving? What if he had questioned the mother? What if he had called the police that night instead of waiting? Maybe Emily wouldn't be missing. Maybe Sarah wouldn't have vanished. He barely ate. He barely slept. And when he did, his dreams were filled with Emily's terrified eyes staring back at him, her whisper ringing in his ears. "Please, help me." The entire city was on edge. The news covered the disappearance relentlessly. Flyers with Emily's face were plastered across walls, bus stops, and store windows. Social media exploded with theories. Some believed it was a kidnapping. Others suspected the mother had been running from something. But no one knew for sure. David tried to go about his routine, but it was impossible to focus. Every time he climbed into the driver's seat, he found himself scanning the sidewalks looking for Emily. And then, on the 3rd night, something happened that made his blood run cold. His phone rang. It was late, well past midnight, and he had just gotten home. He stared at the unknown number for a moment before answering, his heart already racing. "Hello?" There was a pause. Then a small, trembling voice spoke. "Mr. Miller." David froze. His grip on the phone tightened. It was a child's voice. It was Emily. His breath hitched. "Emily. Please," she whispered. "I need your help. Mommy said you were good." David's knees nearly gave out. He stumbled back against the kitchen counter, his mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. "Emily, where are you?" His voice was urgent but calm, forcing himself to stay composed. A faint sniffle, then silence. "Emily, listen to me." David pressed. "Are you safe?" More silence, and then, "I don't know where I am," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's dark." David's heart pounded. He opened his mouth to ask more, but then the line went dead. "Emily, Emily." Nothing. David stood there, staring at his phone in horror. His hands were shaking. A missing child. Calling him. How had she even gotten his number? Where was she? And why did he have the sinking feeling that whatever was happening was only getting worse? David's pulse pounded as he stared at his phone, the call already disconnected. What the hell just happened? For a moment, he couldn't move, he couldn't think. His body felt frozen between panic and disbelief. Emily Carter, the missing girl, had just called him. And now she was gone again. His hands fumbled as he redialed the unknown number, his breath shallow. 1 ring. 2 rings. Voicemail. David ran a shaky hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. This wasn't a prank. That had been Emily's voice, trembling, afraid she didn't know where she was. His first instinct was to call Detective Hughes, but then another thought struck him. A terrifying one. What if someone had taken her? What if she had called him because she didn't trust the police? What if, by going to them, he'd only make things worse? His fingers hovered over the screen, torn between dialing Hughes or waiting, and then his phone buzzed again. A message. David's stomach flipped as he read the text. "Oh, don't tell the police, please." His mouth went dry. Emily. She was still out there, and she was scared of something bigger than just being lost. David grabbed his coat, adrenaline surging through his veins. If Emily needed his help, and if she had reached out to him, then he couldn't just sit around waiting for the police to do their job. He had to find her himself. But where the hell did he even start? At the police station, Detective Rachel Hughes frowned at her computer screen. She had spent the last 72 hours chasing dead ends. Sarah and Emily Carter had seemingly vanished into thin air. No ransom demands, no confirmed sightings, nothing. And now, the bus driver from the night they disappeared had reported a call from Emily. Hughes leaned back in her chair, chewing on the end of her pen. Something didn't add up. Why would Emily call him? And why did he look so damn nervous when he told her about it? A feeling settled in her gut, one that told her David Miller was either in over his head or hiding something. Either way, she wasn't about to let him go off on his own. She grabbed her jacket and keys, determination hardening her expression. It was time to follow David Miller. David's heart pounded as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing through the events of the last few minutes. Emily's voice still echoed in his ears, fragile and desperate, whispering into the phone as if she was afraid someone might hear her. "I don't know where I am. It's dark." Then came the text. "Don't tell the police, please." And finally, coordinates. A location on the outskirts of Melbourne, far from any residential areas, far from the places a little girl should ever be. The address didn't even have a street name, just a dirt road leading into what looked like nothing but dense trees and abandoned buildings. Something about it sent a chill through his bones. This wasn't a place a child should be. It wasn't a place anyone should be. For a long moment, David wrestled with what to do. His first instinct was to call Detective Hughes, to let the professionals handle it. But the memory of Emily's last message held him back. Come alone. Why would a 5-year-old tell him that? What was she afraid of? His gut twisted. With uncertainty. He was just a bus driver, not a cop, not a hero. He had no idea what he was walking into. But one thing he knew for sure. Emily had chosen him to call. She was out there, alone, afraid, and if she had reached out to him, it meant she had no one else. That was enough. Slamming the car into gear, he pulled out of his parking space and headed toward the unknown. The drive took him nearly 40 minutes, long enough for the city's bright lights to disappear in his rearview mirror, swallowed by the shadows of the outskirts. The streets grew quieter, the buildings fewer, replaced by abandoned lots, overgrown fields, and long stretches of cracked pavement that hadn't seen maintenance in years. His headlights were the only source of illumination as he followed, the GPS's instructions, guiding him down a narrow, winding road flanked by towering trees that swayed ominously in the night breeze. As he neared the location, the pavement ended, replaced by a dirt path that crunched beneath his tires. He slowed the car, glancing around warily. The houses here weren't really houses anymore, just skeletal remains of forgotten structures, their windows shattered, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. A sense of isolation pressed in on him. Then, at the very end of the road, he saw it. The house. It stood apart from the others, barely visible under the moonlight. It had once been white, but time and weather had left it dull and gray, its paint peeling away in uneven patches. Vines crept up the sides like twisted fingers, and boards were nailed haphazardly over the windows. The front porch sagged, under years of rot, and a rusted mailbox, barely hanging onto its post, stood at an awkward angle. David parked a short distance away, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. He rolled down his window slightly, listening, but the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. No lights, no movement, but something was there. He could feel it. A creeping sense of unease crawled up his spine, but he forced himself to focus. He had come this far, he wasn't turning back now. Taking a steadying breath, he stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. The night air was colder than he expected, or maybe it was just the adrenaline making his skin prickle. His hands were damp with sweat as he approached the porch, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. That's when he saw it. A tiny pink shoe, sitting just near the steps. David's stomach twisted into knots. Emily. His breath came uneven as he bent down, carefully picking up the shoe. It was small, lightweight, barely big enough to fit in his palm. His fingers tightened around it and his pulse quickened. She had been here, or she still was. For a moment, doubt threatened to paralyze him. What if he was walking into a trap? What if someone had forced Emily to make that call? What if this wasn't about a missing child at all, but something far more sinister? He glanced back at his car, debating whether to call the police despite Emily's warning. But then his eyes fell back on the shoe, and something inside him hardened. He couldn't walk away. Swallowing his fear, he turned back to the house and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the still night. He reached for the doorknob, expecting resistance, but his breath hitched when he realized something else. The door wasn't locked. David hesitated only for a second before pushing it open. The darkness inside swallowed him whole. The door creaked as David pushed it open, revealing a thick wall of darkness beyond the threshold. A stale, musty smell hit him instantly, the scent of damp wood, mold, and something else, something metallic and faintly sour. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped inside, his breath slow and controlled. The floor beneath him felt uneven, the old wooden planks groaning under his weight. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, the bright beam slicing through the darkness. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, disturbed by his presence. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, curling at the edges, revealing the rotting wood underneath. The furniture, what little remained, was broken, chairs missing legs, a collapsed bookshelf leaning against the far wall. A tattered couch sat in the corner, its fabric torn and faded, stuffing spilling from its sides like exposed wounds. There was no sign of Emily. David swallowed hard. "Emily," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the scattered debris on the floor. Old newspapers, empty cans, broken glass. Then something caught his eye. Footprints. Tiny, barely visible in the dust-covered floorboards. Children's footprints. David's stomach clenched. He wasn't imagining things. Emily had been here. His flashlight followed the tracks, leading toward a partially open door at the end of the hallway. The air grew colder as he moved forward, his steps cautious, deliberate. A faint sound reached his ears, a soft, almost rhythmic tapping, like something swaying against wood. He pushed the door open. The beam of light fell onto a small, windowless room. In the corner, huddled against the wall, sat a tiny figure, Emily. Her pink jacket was covered in dust and her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her small hands clutched a backpack against her body as if it were the only thing keeping her safe. David exhaled, relief flooding through him. "Emily," he whispered, stepping closer. The little girl lifted her head, her eyes, wide and filled with fear, locked onto him. "I knew you'd come," she murmured. David crouched down, his voice gentle but urgent. "Emily, we have to go. It's not safe here." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. David noticed then, her lips were dry, her face pale. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't eaten or slept properly in days. His gaze flickered to the backpack she was holding so tightly. "Emily, where's your mom?" he asked carefully. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head. "Like she's not here." David's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Where did she go?" Emily hesitated before slowly unzipping the front pocket of her backpack. She reached inside and pulled out something crumpled, a folded piece of paper covered in hurried handwriting. David took it with trembling fingers. The note was messy, rushed, written as if the person hadn't had much time. "If something happens to me, trust David Miller." David's breath caught in his throat. His name. Sarah had written his name. His skin went cold. How the hell did Sarah Carter know who he was? And what exactly had happened to her? David's hands trembled as he read the note again, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. "If something happens to me, trust David Miller." It didn't make sense. Sarah Carter, Emily's missing mother, knew who he was. Not just that. She trusted him enough to leave his name in a desperate and final message. But how? David swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. "Emily," he said carefully, keeping his voice calm. "Did your mom tell you about me?" The little girl nodded slowly, still clutching her backpack as if it were a lifeline. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. "When?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward the dark corners of the abandoned house, as if she were afraid something might be lurking there. Finally, she whispered, "A long time ago." David's mind raced. A long time ago. He had never met Sarah Carter before that night on the bus. He was sure of it. He would have remembered. Wouldn't he? His heart pounded as the first sliver of doubt crept in. Before he could ask more, a distant noise made them both freeze. A car engine. David turned off his flashlight instantly, plunging them into darkness. He moved quickly, pulling Emily close and positioning himself between her and the doorway. His breathing was shallow, ears straining to hear. The sound grew louder, tires crunching over gravel. A slow, deliberate approach. Someone was coming. Emily's small fingers gripped his sleeve. "Is it Mommy?" she whispered. David's. Gut told him no. He crouched down beside her, lowering his voice. We have to be very quiet, okay? Emily nodded, her tiny body tense against his. The car stopped outside. A door creaked open. David held his breath. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming closer. A shadow passed by the broken window, barely visible in the slivers of moonlight filtering through the boarded-up glass. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were searching. David's mind raced. If they were looking for Emily, they wouldn't leave without checking inside. And if they found them... A sharp knock on the front door made both him and Emily flinch. Sarah. A man's voice, rough and impatient. I know you're in... there. David's stomach twisted. Who the hell was that? Emily clutched his arm tighter. He could feel her shaking. The voice called again, more forceful this time. Open the door. David's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Whoever this was, he wasn't friendly. 10 years ago, David was 27 years old when he pulled his bus over in the middle of a rainy night for a woman standing alone at a stop with nothing but a backpack. She was soaking wet, her clothes clinging to her thin frame, dark hair plastered to her pale face. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear. But what David remembered most, her hands were shaking. Are you okay? He had asked as she climbed aboard, dripping water onto the floor. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, just needed to get out of here. David didn't push. He had seen plenty of people running from something. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. But now, years later, standing in that abandoned house with Emily at his side, his blood ran cold as something clicked into place. Sarah Carter, the woman from that rainy night. She had been running back then, just like she was running now, and somehow, David was part of it. The knock came again, harder this time. Sarah, I'm not leaving. Open the damn door. David and Emily remained frozen in the darkness. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding against his ribs. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just passing by. He knew Sarah had been here. David could feel Emily trembling beside him, her small fingers digging into his sleeve. He leaned down, whispering so low it was almost inaudible. Do you know who that is? Emily hesitated before nodding slowly. David's stomach twisted. Who is he? Emily swallowed hard. The bad man. Outside, the front door rattled as the man tested the handle. Locked. A beat of silence. Then, a loud crash as something slammed against the wood. David didn't wait to see if the door would hold. He grabbed Emily's hand and moved swiftly toward the back of the room. His flashlight was off, but he could still make out the outline of an old cabinet pushed against the wall. A quick glance around told him what he already feared. There was no back door. They were trapped. The door crashed again, the wood splintering under the force. Emily let out a tiny gasp, and David immediately crouched down in front of her. Listen to me, he whispered, gripping her shoulders. We're going to hide, okay? No matter what happens, you stay quiet. You don't come out unless I say so, understand? Emily nodded, though her eyes were filled with fear. David scanned the room frantically. His gaze landed on a small gap behind the broken cabinet. It was barely enough space, but Emily could fit. Without hesitating, he moved the cabinet slightly and helped her crawl in. Stay here, he murmured. I'll come back for you. Emily clutched his wrist, her eyes pleading. Don't leave. David forced a reassuring smile. I promise, I'll be right here. The door exploded inward. A dark figure stepped into the house. David barely had time to move before the beam of a flashlight swept across the room, landing directly on him. Well, well, the man muttered, stepping forward. David's body went rigid as he got his first proper look at the intruder. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark leather jacket. His face was shadowed under the dim light, but his eyes, cold, calculating, locked, onto David with something between amusement and menace. "Who the hell are you?" the man asked. David's mind worked fast. He needed to keep the man's attention on him, not Emily. "I was about to ask you the same thing," he said, straightening his stance. The man took another step inside, his boots crunching over the debris on the floor. "See, I was looking for someone, a woman and her kid, and instead, I find you." His lips curled into something that might have been a smirk, if not for the way his hand hovered near his jacket pocket. David knew that kind of stance. This man was armed. He forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know who you're looking for, but no one else is here." The man tilted his head, as if considering. Then, he took another step, and another. David subtly shifted his stance, preparing for the worst. Then, the man spoke again. "You know, Sarah was real good at running, but not good enough." David's blood turned to ice. He kept his face unreadable. But inside, a storm was raging. Sarah had been running from this man, which meant, "Where is she?" David asked, his voice steady, despite the dread creeping through his veins. The man let out a low chuckle. "Dead, most likely." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Emily's mother, dead. He glanced, just for a fraction of a second, toward the cabinet where Emily was hidden. The man didn't seem to notice. David clenched his fists, rage simmering beneath his skin. Sarah had trusted him. She had left her daughter in his hands, written his name in that note. And now she was gone. And this man, this bastard, had something to do with it. David took a slow breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You seem pretty sure about that," he said. The man's smirk widened. "Because I made sure of it." David didn't hesitate. Before the man could react, David lunged. David's body moved on instinct. He surged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. The man's smirk twisted into surprise, but he wasn't slow. His hand darted toward his jacket, reaching for whatever weapon he had hidden there. Too late. David's shoulder slammed into his chest, sending them both crashing against the rotting wall. The house trembled with the impact, dust and splinters raining down from the ceiling. The man let out a grunt as he staggered back, but David didn't give him a chance to recover. He swung. His fist connected with the man's jaw, snapping his head to the side. The stranger stumbled, cursing. But before David could land another blow, he felt a sudden, searing pain in his side. A punch. No, something sharp. David gasped as the man drove a knife into his ribs, just below his left side. Not deep, but enough to burn like fire. He staggered back, clutching, the wound as warmth spread under his fingers. The man straightened, rubbing his jaw where David had hit him. He was breathing heavily now, his smirk replaced with something colder. "You've got a good punch," he admitted, flicking the knife between his fingers. "But you're out of your league." David's vision blurred for a second, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. He had been in fights before, years ago, back when he was young and reckless. He knew how to take a hit. But this wasn't just a fight. Emily was here, watching, terrified. And if David lost, she wouldn't stand a chance. The man took a slow step forward, twirling the knife. "You should have stayed out of this," he muttered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." David's mind worked fast. He needed a weapon, anything to turn the fight in his favor. His eyes darted around the room, searching. The broken chair in the corner, the rusty lamp lying on the floor, the thick wooden beam supporting the ceiling. There. The moment the man lunged, David grabbed the loose wooden plank from the wall and swung with everything he had. The plank connected with the side of the man's head, shattering into pieces. The stranger let out a choked sound and dropped to his knees, dazed. The knife clattered from his fingers onto the floor. David didn't hesitate. He kicked the blade far across the room, then grabbed the man's collar and pulled him forward, his voice low and furious. "Where is Sarah?" The man coughed. blinking blood out of his eyes. He gave a breathless, twisted laugh. Dead! David tightened his grip. Try again. The man let out a pained groan, then muttered, Hospital. David froze. What? The man spat blood onto the floor. She was in a car accident 3 nights ago. She's in a coma. But if she wakes up... He let out another laugh, softer this time. She won't live long. David's pulse pounded in his ears. Sarah was alive. Emily's mother was still alive. But if what this bastard was saying was true, she was still in danger. David didn't waste another second. He let go of the man and turned toward the cabinet where Emily was hiding. It's okay, he whispered. We have to go. Emily hesitated before crawling out, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto David's bleeding side. You're hurt, she murmured. David forced a smile. I've had worse. He took her hand and moved quickly toward the door. They had to get out now. But just as they reached the front porch, David heard the man behind them moving. He turned in time to see him reaching for something at his ankle, another knife. David barely had time to react before the man threw it. Emily screamed. David twisted, shielding her. The knife sliced across his shoulder, pain flashing through him. But he didn't stop. He scooped Emily into his arms and ran. The cold night air hit them like a wall as David sprinted toward the car. His wound burned, his body ached, but he didn't stop. Emily was safe. That was all that mattered. He shoved the driver's door open, placing Emily inside. Lock the doors, he ordered, his voice urgent. She obeyed without hesitation. David turned back just in time to see the man stumbling out of the house, his face twisted in rage. He was too far now, too slow. David threw himself into the driver's seat, started the car, and slammed on the gas. The tires screeched against the gravel as they sped down the dark road. The abandoned house disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. Emily was crying quietly in the seat beside him, her small hands clutching her backpack. David exhaled shakily, keeping one hand pressed against his bleeding side. They weren't safe yet, but now, at least, they had hope. Sarah was still alive, and David was going to make damn sure she stayed that way. David's fingers clenched around the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The car roared down the darkened road, its headlights slicing through the night. His side burned from the stab wound, and his shoulder throbbed where the knife had grazed him. But he couldn't focus on the pain. All that mattered was getting Emily to safety. She sat curled up in the passenger seat, her small body trembling. She hadn't said a word since they left the abandoned house, but her hands were still gripping her backpack tightly, as if letting go would mean losing control of everything. David glanced at her, his voice softer now. We're gonna find your mom, kiddo. Emily turned her tear-filled eyes toward him. Is she really alive? David nodded, pushing the car faster. That's what he said, and I'm not about to let her die. But doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. If Sarah was in a hospital, why hadn't the police mentioned it? Why had the news reported her and Emily as missing, instead of just Emily? And more importantly, who was that man, and why was he trying to kill her? David didn't know the full story yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Whoever that man was, he wasn't done hunting them. He had to move fast. 30 minutes later, David pulled up to the nearest police station. The pain in his ribs flared as he climbed out of the car, but he ignored it. He hurried around to Emily's side, opening the door. She hesitated. You said not to tell the police? She whispered. David crouched down to her level, wincing as his body protested the movement. I know, but that was before we knew your mom was alive. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. I won't let them take you away from her. I promise. Emily chewed on her lip but nodded. She took his hand, and together, they walked through the glass doors of the station. Detective Rachel Hughes looked up from her desk as David burst into the room, blood staining his shirt. She barely had time to react before she saw Emily Carter beside him, clutching his arm. The detective shot up from her chair. Jesus Christ, Miller. What the hell? David didn't let her finish. Sarah Carter is alive. She's in a hospital. Hughes froze. What? David pulled the crumpled note from his pocket, the one Sarah had left behind. I found Emily at an abandoned house. She had this in her bag. Sarah knew something was going to happen to her. Hughes took the paper, reading the hurried handwriting. Her face darkened. You should have come to me the second you got that call, Miller. David's patience snapped. Yeah, and if I had, Emily might be dead right now. Some guy, big, dangerous, broke into that house looking for her. He had a knife. Hughes. He tried to kill us. That got her attention. She grabbed her radio. Get me an immediate search on all recent hospital intakes. Female, mid-30s, severe injuries from a car accident. Name? Sarah Carter. Static crackled before an officer responded. Confirming one match. Patient admitted 3 nights ago. Royal Melbourne Hospital. Condition: coma. No registered visitors or family. David exhaled, relief washing over him. She was alive. Emily's grip on his arm tightened. Can we see her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hughes hesitated, then nodded. Let's go. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a dull glow. Emily clung to David's hand as they walked down the long hallway, her small legs struggling to keep up. Hughes led the way, flashing her badge to bypass security. Room 317. They stopped outside the door, and for the first time since this nightmare began, David saw fear in Emily's eyes. Not the fear of running, of hiding, of being hunted, but the fear of what she might find inside. David knelt beside her, his voice gentle. Oh, she's waiting for you. Emily hesitated. Then, slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Sarah Carter lay on the hospital bed, her face pale, her body fragile beneath the thin blanket. Bandages covered her forehead, her arms lined with IVs. She looked so still, so weak, so different from the woman who had pulled Emily away on the bus just days ago. Emily let out a tiny gasp, her small fingers flying to her mouth. Then she ran. She ran straight to the bedside, grabbing her mother's hand. Mommy. Her voice was trembling. It's me. It's Emily. I found you. Nothing. Sarah didn't move. David's chest tightened. She was alive, but for how long? Emily sniffled, her tiny hands squeezing her mother's fingers. Please wake up, she whispered. Please. David had never felt so helpless in his life. But then Sarah's fingers twitched. Emily's eyes widened. Mommy! The heart monitor beeped faster. Then, slowly, painfully, Sarah Carter's eyelids fluttered open. A sharp gasp filled the quiet hospital room. Sarah Carter's eyelids fluttered open, her hazel eyes glassy and unfocused as they adjusted to the harsh fluorescent light. She blinked, her breath shallow, confusion etched across her pale face. Then, her gaze shifted and landed on Emily. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she clutched her mother's hand tighter. Mommy, you're awake. Sarah's lips parted, her voice weak and barely above a whisper. Emily. David exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief crashed over him like a wave. Emily let out a small sob and buried her face against her mother's arm. I thought you were gone. I was so scared. Sarah's fingers trembled as she weakly squeezed Emily's hand. Though her body was frail, there was still something fierce in her eyes. You're safe, she rasped. David stepped closer. She's safe, he confirmed. You both are now. Sarah's gaze lifted toward him, blinking in dazed recognition. For a moment, she simply stared, as if trying to place a distant memory. Then, the realization hit her. David. Miller. His stomach clenched at the way she said his name. like it wasn't just a name, but a lifeline. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry, but she forced herself to speak. You were there, the night I ran. David's pulse quickened. You remember? Sarah gave a faint nod, her eyes glistening. You picked me up that night, on the bus. Years ago. Her breath shuddered. I never forgot you. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. So it was true. Sarah Carter was the same woman from that rainy night, the one who had boarded his bus, soaked and shaking, carrying nothing but a backpack. She had been running then, just like she had been running now. Detective Hughes cleared her throat, stepping forward. Sarah, we need to know. Who was that man, the one after you and Emily? Sarah's expression darkened. For the first time since waking up, her fragile body seemed to gather strength. His name is Richard Hale. David exchanged a glance with Hughes. Who is he? Sarah exhaled shakily. My ex, a very dangerous man. Her voice cracked. Emily's father. David's stomach dropped. Hughes's face hardened. Go on. Sarah swallowed. I left him before Emily was born. I knew he'd never let me go if he found out I was pregnant. So I disappeared. I changed my name. I hid for years, but I always knew he'd come looking eventually. She looked at Emily with an ache in her expression, brushing a weak hand over her daughter's curls. He found us 3 nights ago. He ran me off the road. David clenched his fists. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice weak but filled with resolve. I knew I wouldn't be able to protect her if he got to me, so I left her in that house and told her to call you. David's throat tightened. Why me? A small, tired smile touched Sarah's lips. Because you were the only good man I ever met. Silence filled the room. Hughes was the first to break it, pulling out her phone. We need to move fast. If Richard Hale is still out there, we'll find him. But we'll need your help, Sarah. Sarah nodded, her grip on Emily tightening. I'll do whatever it takes to keep my daughter safe. Emily, who had been listening quietly, turned to David. Are you leaving? She asked softly. David hesitated. His job was done, wasn't it? He had protected Emily, gotten her back to her mother. That's what mattered. But looking at her now, her small fingers still clinging to his sleeve, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear, David realized something. Somewhere in the past few days, Emily had stopped being just a lost child. She had become his kid. Sarah must have seen the hesitation in his face because she spoke first. David. He met her gaze. You don't have to go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's lips trembled. Stay with us. David's heart clenched. For years, his life had been routine. Drive the bus. Go home. Repeat. But this was something he had never expected. A chance to matter. A chance to belong. He swallowed hard, then smiled. Yeah, kiddo. I'll stay. Emily threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. Sarah's eyes glistened with emotion. Thank you, David, for everything. David looked at her, then at Emily, and for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't even realized was missing. A home. 3 months later, the small suburban house was filled with laughter as Emily ran across the backyard, her curls bouncing in the wind. David sat on the porch steps, a beer in one hand, watching as she chased the neighbor's dog around the grass. Sarah joined him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She was still recovering, but her strength had returned, and so had her smile. You look happy, she said, watching Emily with him. David chuckled. Yeah, I guess I am. Sarah glanced at him, something warm in her expression. You know, she calls you Dad when she talks about you to her friends. David's chest tightened, but in a good way. He exhaled and nodding. I like the sound of that. Sarah smiled. So do I. David took a sip of his beer, watching Emily giggle as she rolled on the grass. He had spent years driving people to their destinations, but somehow, without even realizing it, he had finally found his own.